You know your exit plan. Hey, if the panel keeps rolling, you're just gonna, like we said, dunk and run. All right. Next up, a very fascinating discussion about ending the FUD. I'm not quite sure what that means. It's some kind of code for something. Although I will say that this photo was recently taken of somebody perhaps adding fuel to the FUD. But we're going to debate that now on this fantastic panel, as led by the one and only Prem Barbosa.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Jack. You're so kind, so generous with your energy.
As close to your chin as possible.
I know it's been a long day, everyone. So thank you so much for hanging in there and hanging with us.
Pointed to you and up close.
Yeah, you want to, you got to handle that mic like you own it, Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. So, end the FUD, shaping Bitcoin narratives. To me, beyond just being a Bitcoiner and beyond just dealing with the concepts that you see in the headlines about Bitcoin, there are a lot of skills that someone, I think, develops or needs to develop as they become a Bitcoiner. And it's so important, beyond just Bitcoin, to be able to address FUD, to be able to address, in other words, misrepresentations, or as they like to call them, misinformation, disinformation, etc. So I wanted to give one quick example, and I'm going to open up to these great panelists over here. A lot of people in this room I can see are older than me, no offense, it's wonderful to be alive, but you will remember then, perhaps, something called the War on Terror, a phrase that gets said so rarely these days, but it's not something that I think has even officially ended. We still have, active laws that permit our government to enact violence to try to pursue this war on terror. Now, after the United States was attacked on September 11, 2001, more than 20 years ago, we invaded Afghanistan, and this is not what I want to talk about. It's actually in 2003, when the United States starts developing a narrative that Iraq, the country of Iraq, which at the time was controlled by a dictator called Saddam Hussein, our government was trying to promulgate with the mainstream media that Iraq was actually involved with the 9/11 attacks, that the Iraqi government had been involved with Al-Qaeda in planning and enacting the 9/11 attacks and other forms of terrorism. And there was a specific event on some Sunday in 2003. I can't remember which Sunday, but the vice president of our nation, Dick Cheney, he goes on a bunch of these morning shows, and he's got I've got this memo that was just released by the intelligence agencies, 19 or however many agencies. They say that someone from Iraq met with an Al-Qaeda operative in Paris. Oh no, we gotta invade Iraq. And the rest is history, right? We invade Iraq. That memo was a lie. The basis for the United States invading Iraq was a lie. But at the time, 2003, I hadn't even graduated high school yet. I'd been called un-American, a terrorist sympathizer, all kinds of horrible things at such a young age because I dared to question the narrative. They're not telling us the truth. And at a certain point, no one even cared why we were in the war anymore. It's just, we got to win it. So to me, that was a big wake-up call. That was a big wake-up call that we can't trust our media. We can't trust the media because the relationships they have with the government, because the relationships they have with their advertisers and other forces. So that was my example. But now I want to invite my wonderful panel who's sitting next to me. If you guys can think of something related to what I'm talking about, either a story that happened or some event that happened to kind of wake you up or to reveal to you, wait a minute, I'm being fed stories that are not actually, one, true, and two, they don't benefit me. They don't make me better. They don't make me better capable of handling and dealing with reality. So let me pass it off to, hey, Michelle, what's up?
What's up, guys? We all know it was an inside job, but that might be a different panel. No, I think this is really, really important. And I think a lot of the things that Jackie spoke about earlier are super important. I'm glad we can have this conversation. For me, one of the big things, I've always sort of questioned everything, and But I think one of the biggest examples for me was I was living abroad in 2015, 16. I was not living in the United States when Trump initially ran for the presidency, and I was not active in politics at the time. I was living actually in Dubai. I was doing a lot of work in China, so really didn't have very much exposure even to Western media, and I had no idea. Like my what I knew about Trump was that he had the show that everybody loved, right? And sure, not everybody loved him, but that was sort of the end of it, right? He was a media personality. And I had no idea the sort of like psychological operation that was developing in the United States, and that it was becoming as polarizing as it was, and that you couldn't even question it. You couldn't have an honest conversation about it. So when I came back to the States, it was a huge wake up call for me. I was just kind of like, oh yeah, like what did you think? Like, I don't care how you voted. I don't care if you like the guy, if you hate him, but I'm just honest in like your honest opinion. Like businessman runs for presidency. Like that was kind of the opinion of a lot of people in Asia and the Middle East. Like, oh, he's like trying to help, right? He's giving up his life of luxury to be a civil servant. And I got like completely shut down and mocked and called a far right extremist and all of these things simply for like being curious about how people felt about the situation. It had become so black and white and so polarizing so quickly. For me, it became exponentially more important to figure out like, why can we not even discuss this? And so that was a big wake up call for me.
Yeah, we're not talking about Bitcoin just yet. And the reason is because, the skills of critical thinking, being able to analyze facts and things that you're told and to question, is this true? Can I find out if this is true? This is so important, not just for Bitcoiners, but it's true for everyone. And this is a part of our process of like, how did we come to think that, wow, Bitcoin is such an important and revolutionary technology, and I want to dedicate tons of time. And everyone on this panel has dedicated tons of time. Nico, welcome. Why don't you tell us one of your little, what was one of your like, whoa, I can't believe that.
Yeah, it's a great question. Hello, everybody. Hello, Naples. So it's like a really interesting phenomenon, I think, the last 5 to 10 years. And essentially what I think is happening, and to kind of tie into, Prem, what you were talking about earlier when you were talking about the Iraq war and all that, I heard a really powerful comment. I forget who it's from, but it's basically like, if social media existed in the early 2000s, we would not have gone to war with Iraq. I think what social media has enabled is like mass scale peer-to-peer communications. And if you're a government trying to control a narrative, it kind of becomes difficult when you can just grow your own platform independently and speak to people. So to answer your question, Prem, like where things started to get a little bit weird for me was when I was doing my show, and what I was talking about in my show was more accurate in terms of the truth than what these so-called professional journalists were saying on TV. And that's when things really kind of hit me in the face, because I realized like, wow, like the media isn't really in the business of news. The media is really kind of in the business of propaganda. And it's really, really well done. I mean, the whole like media industrial complex, like I like to call it, like you can connect the movies with the late night shows, with the news desk shows, and it all interconnects to paint this very rosy picture of what the approved story is, what the approved narrative is, and anything outside of that rosy little bubble is essentially called misinformation, extremism, dangerous. My favorite, it's a danger to democracy. I think I've heard that 50,000 times. So yeah, it's really kind of this interesting place where we are, but I think things have changed, Prem, like dramatically since Elon acquired Twitter. And the the Twitter files came out, and it really showed that the US government was going out. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg recently came out on Joe Rogan podcast basically admitting this. In this country, with First Amendment protections, did not matter. The US government was putting pressure on social medias to censor the certain speech of Americans. That is absolutely insane. So I think this phenomenon of what I call the disintermediation of information enabled by mass scale peer-to-peer communications, aka social media, is a very interesting phenomenon. And I think the next phenomenon, to kind of tie in Bitcoin a little bit, that I think we're about to enter is the disintermediation of money. And look at how much they fought the disintermediation of information. Like, they fought tooth and nail to keep control of the narrative. They did not want people thinking freely, discussing freely, thinking critically. And now, with the disintermediation of money, we're going to their source of revenue. We're going to their source of power. The government's unique ability to create money for free that everyone else has to work for. I think Bitcoin is a fundamental threat to that. And I think that's the battle to come. But the fight for free speech is the front line. Because if we can't question inflation, if we can't question the money freely without getting deplatformed, how else are we going to awaken the masses to the reality that the money's broken, right? So I think that was an excellent question, Prem.
Yeah, I think one of the big aspects of the idea of free speech, it's not enough to have free speech. We have to also have the bravery to use it. And in these crazy times where you see that freedom being so tenuous, this is the time it's most important to stretch those muscles. Now let's maybe talk about something a little bit more Bitcoin specific, but still on this idea of people trying to promote narratives to confuse us. Gabe, there was a recent book that was published, I think it was an autobiographical book, Hijacking Bitcoin, that's what it was called, right? And you have been working on a project, working on something. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that? Tell us a little about what that book is and why you care about it.
Yeah. So this book came out last year. It's co-signed by Roger Ver, who was a very early Bitcoiner, Bitcoin investor, started and helped start several businesses in the space. He claims he's the first one. But he recently released this book, Hijacking Bitcoin. Have we heard of that? Anybody heard it? Anybody read it? Yeah.
Did you, Gabe?
I have read it.
Sorry.
I'm now on a couple passes because what I'm doing is completely dismantling some of the claims that are made in that book. That essentially the book is claiming that Bitcoin has been taken over by intelligency actors and through the developers, Bitcoin protocol developers, which is complete bullshit. And I'm gonna completely dismantle that entire claim with facts that are not conveniently left out in of the book in the notes in the back. But we're going to see more of this kind of FUD coming out specifically against Bitcoin because it is the thing that's disintermediating the propagators and the people that are promoting this propagandist material because this is our path to freedom. And they're going to absolutely try to take it away from us or shy us away from digging in deeper into understanding how it works and how we are in control. We can take back our control. They don't want that, so they're going to try to create these narratives to turn you away from it. And so we have to shield ourselves with understanding and knowledge of why these things are lies. You got to see through the lies. And I love, by the way, conspiracy theories. I seek them out because it, for one, obviously you don't have to believe all the conspiracies, right? What it does is it challenges your perceptions and it challenges what you might have been programmed to think about these issues. And so you can go back to first order principles in critically thinking about these issues, what may or may not be true, and trying to decipher what reality actually is. What is the truth behind these matters? And a lot of the times, especially the last handful of years, the conspiracy theorists are actually have a really good track record, which should tell you something. So,
well, some of them do. And I think there's a certain audacity of someone trying to publish a false narrative, especially about Bitcoin, where so much of what happened is public record and is so easily available. And then it goes back to what I said a few minutes ago about, well, if no one, like, I'm not going to read the book. Thank you for reading the book, because the fact that you're willing to do it and you're willing to put this effort and do the work, you're going to fight that FUD, right? I'm never going to fight that FUD because I'm never going to know what's in that book. So people are going to read that book and they're going to have all kinds of questions, or they're going to think they're going to know a certain history of Bitcoin, and they need someone like you to come and be like, well, wait a minute, let me show you a couple of other facts and ideas. Nick, welcome on board.
Thank you.
Any thoughts or any particular like storylines or narratives that you want to bring up?
Well, one thing that when Gabe was just saying that, one thing that kind of came to my mind was like FUD, and it's kind of like the same thing as when somebody hates you and they're spreading hate about you. It's usually because you're doing something that they're jealous of, and their only way to react is to say something negative about you and spread that hate to try to belittle you, make you feel like what you're doing is wrong, or just basically just belittle you. But in a more of a personal experience for me, one of the things that kind of opened my eyes, which from the Bitcoin journey, is just kind of like the problem with our food in America, and how much we've been lied to about just the food pyramid, what's good for us, what's bad for us. And it really opened my eyes that, the sugar, the seed oils, and all this stuff that's in our food, it's really like, it's fiat food. It's just made of a bunch of bullshit. And you put this stuff into your body, and that stuff affects your mind, and it all keeps you in this weird, in this rat wheel that's not really serving you at all. And they're telling you the stuff that's best for you, like meat, is actually bad for you, and it should be the smallest part of your diet, but you should eat more carbs, you should eat more seed oils, and going to the grocery store and just going down the aisles, looking at the ingredients, and it's in everything. So the whole fiat system has really taken its claws into everything in our life. So for me, like, food has been something that I've really, like, in a weird way, Bitcoin brought me to have more clarity on what I should be eating and what I should not be eating.
When you start to go down certain Bitcoin rabbit holes, especially when you go down the food, health, quality rabbit hole, start to look at the ingredients when you go to the supermarkets, like, can I eat this, can I not eat this? And it gets pretty stressful because there's a lot of things you can't eat. And you imagine, like, oh, well, they wouldn't put stuff in the food that would be bad for me. Like, the government wouldn't let them do that, right? And then the companies, they wouldn't do that either, right? Like, they wouldn't risk the health and well-being of their customers, just for profit, right? They wouldn't do that. And so a lot of times we kind of develop this assumption as we grow up in this country, especially if you go through our educational system, that the government has your best interests at heart, and all of these things are working the way they're supposed to work. And unfortunately, when we're talking about like news and FUD, there's actually a particular issue I wanted to ask Michelle about. So there's a law that was repealed a few years ago. It's called the Schmidt-Mundt Act. Is it Smith?
The Smith-Mundt Act of 1948.
Yeah. And so what was that act in 1948? And then why did they repeal it like recently?
Yeah, well, it was a while ago now. It was actually in 2013. And so the Smith-Mundt Act of 1948 explicitly forbid U.S. government agencies from running propaganda domestically on its own people. And in 2013, Obama repealed it. It's actually kind of hard to look into, like anything else. The truth is really obfuscated because they don't want you to know the truth about what they did. So even if you Google it, it's going to, like, what you'll find is that the act was modernized, so they just changed it a little bit. But if you really dig into the details of those changes that were made, you will find the little tiny edit that prior to the modernization forbid agencies from running domestic propaganda. And since 2013, they have been allowed to. So that has really really centralized the propaganda that comes down, and the control of the narratives, because it gave them this huge like distribution channels, right? Like all the distribution channels. And I think it's really important what we're doing, like Nico mentioned, social media and kind of like hacking away at that. But yeah, reinstate the Smith-Mundt Act.
I mean, how did the media go so long without being willing to even question Joe Biden's competency as the leader of the country? Like, I'm a very open-minded and forgiving and accepting person. I'm apolitical, I'm nonpartisan. But I could see that from a mile away. I could see that from a long time ago. And then the fact, like, how could they do that for so long unless it was deliberate? You really think all of these people who are so close to Joe Biden all the time, all of these, White House correspondents who are on, following him all the time, none of these people noticed this? Of course they noticed it.
He's sharp as a tack.
Yes.
That was the line. Sharp as a tack.
Yeah. Now, there are certain time constraints for our panel. So, Nico, I want to ask you, as we move into, so I think we've laid out pretty clearly. There's a lot of false information. There's a lot of lies that are being promulgated as truth throughout various forms in our society. Now, what we do every day in specific ways as Bitcoiners, as human beings, as Americans in certain cases, as we are trying to promote critical thinking and trying to present alternative narratives based on what we consider to be truth, to be facts, without ulterior motives, I have nothing to sell anyone. On March 16th, I'm going to be doing the 200th Bitcoin brunch, a meetup I host every Sunday, and I don't sell anything. I have no Bitcoin. I'm not going to sell you my Bitcoin, and I have no one else's Bitcoin to sell you. So, Nico, how do you, through Simply Bitcoin, through your other efforts, how are you helping to create new narratives, to shape a new narrative to counter all these? Because I agree that we can't fight the mainstream media. We can't fight these forces. They literally have the power of the printing press behind them. So all we can do is provide another example. What are you doing?
Yeah, so it's essentially like people have to realize this is the world that people live in when they consume. I don't even call them mainstream media anymore because their numbers reflect that it's dying essentially. But the world that someone lives in, if they watch the legacy media, is a completely different world compared to the world of someone that gets their news via X or gets their views via social media. It's a completely different reality. So the way that I like to phrase it is, this is narrative trench warfare on the battlegrounds of the internet, and it's essentially winning over the hearts and minds of individuals using speech, right? So how do you combat that? How do you combat legacy media? It's pretty simple. You just tell the truth, right? They operate with a system that was not prepared for social media. They were not prepared for it whatsoever. That's why they freaked out with the whole fact-checking thing. That's why they freaked out when they kept saying misinformation this. And I'll tell you what, it's a one-way door. Once someone starts consuming independent media and they're like, wait a second, this guy or, this narrative isn't true, the world isn't going to spontaneously combust tomorrow. Trump isn't Hitler. Maybe he's a bit of a shitcoiner, but maybe he isn't this guy. So those narratives they break very quickly. They have to keep you within. They have to keep you consuming that media. So one of the things that I realized earlier on is I initially started it's 5 years ago now. With I just want to talk about Bitcoin, make YouTube videos, and then within 1 or 2 years, I remember telling my co-host Opti, I said, "Dude, I think we're reporters, bro." And he's like, "What do you mean?" I was like, "Bro, I think we tell the news to people." And he's like, "Yeah." And I'm like, yeah. And then I remember you have to obviously to do a good job to find out what you want to talk about, you have to do research to certain stories. And I would spend I'd spend time making research, doing research, and then I was like, okay, I have to tell a story, I have to create a narrative. But what would blow my mind, and I think I was saying this earlier, was you would get more accurate information on what was going on with the world if you consume Simply Bitcoin content. Mind you, self-taught YouTubers, no journalistic background whatsoever, and you'd get more accurate information on what was going on in the world of Bitcoin and in the world of politics than you would if you tuned into MSNBC. if that is not on purpose by design, I don't know what is. And the fact that they are professionally trained journalists and the fact that they do go to school for this tells me that it is 100% on purpose. It's 100% malicious. And what you're seeing is the American equivalent to, in the USSR, they had an official newspaper. And the official newspaper was called Pravda. If you translate Pravda, it's a Russian word. If you translate it to English, it means truth, right? So what does that remind you of? The legacy media today in America is the American equivalent of Pravda. And if you tell them that they're lying, if you say that they're lying, they call you crazy. They call you an extremist. They don't combat what you're saying with facts or with debate. They would rather censor you.
Well, they want to shut you up, right?
And the reason they want to censor you and shut you up is because they don't have any good arguments.
Well,
So
I agree with that conclusion. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I'm very accepting and open-minded, and I've met quite a few journalists in my life. I think I'll give most of them the benefit of the doubt, and this is probably not very forgiving, but they're just doing their job.
what?
And that's, and it,
I
hope you catch the reference. So, Nico.
I'll say one more thing, Prem. I'll say one more
The
thing.
Ministry of Truth has spoken.
I'll say one more thing. Look, it's not a coincidence that the most popular content creator on the planet right now is Joe Rogan. And he is not part of any type of legacy media outlet. That's not a coincidence. That is happening because people are sick and tired of being fed lies. And this dude that smokes weed, talks about killing elk, eating elk, and DMT is telling them the truth. And they resonate with that. That's essentially what's happening. But this entire phenomenon, because we have to zoom out and like understand where we are from in a historical context, is happening because of the internet. The internet has disintermediated information, and the internet is about to disintermediate money on a massive scale.
Nico, I want to ask you one question about what you said. Well, for one thing, you're talking about how the numbers of legacy media are dropping. I do want to note that Joe Rogan comes from legacy media. I don't think he would have his position if he hadn't come from legacy media. It wasn't journalism. How do you, though, because I don't think you come from legacy media, at least I don't remember seeing you on CNN before you were on Simply Bitcoin. So can you talk about how did you develop your brand? How did you become Simply Bitcoin? How did that happen?
I mean, so when I always loved YouTube. Like, I always looked up at YouTube, and I was like, I want to be a YouTuber. And I was like 22 or 23 years old, and I was doing the math in my head, and I said, like, if you study other channels, it takes roughly like 6 to 8 years to be somewhat successful and somewhat known. And I did the math. I'm like, okay, so if I start a video game channel now, by the time this is successful, I'm gonna be 30. So I'm gonna be like, okay, so I'm gonna be like making videos about video games when I'm 30 for a living? Like, no, that's probably a bad idea. So what is the second thing I was like very passionate? I was like, Bitcoin. I was like, okay, let me start a YouTube channel about Bitcoin. And at the time, it was like 2020, and there was no Bitcoin only content. Like, there was crypto content and there was Bitcoin content, but there was no Bitcoin only content. And at the Bitcoin 2021 conference in Miami, I was lucky enough to get invited to speak on stage. Mind you, Simply Bitcoin had maybe like 600 subscribers at the time. And I told the crowd, I said, listen, I have an idea. We're going to use all the clickbait kind of tactics and all this engagement tactics that a lot of these altcoin and shitcoin channels use. And I'm going to apply it to Bitcoin. Fast forward 4 to 5 years, I think it turned out all right. But yeah, that was it. I loved YouTube. I loved making content. I didn't want to make content about video games because I thought it would be lame to make content about video games at 30. And I started making content about Bitcoin. And I happened to be lucky because 2020 was the infancy of Bitcoin-only media. There was no Bitcoin-only media. So I guess I was at the right place at the right time. And simultaneously, while all of this was happening, the legitimacy of the legacy media was dying. So it created like an opportunity for independent media to fill its place. But did I know any of this when I started? No. I was actually mining Bitcoin at the time. Looking back, I probably would have made a lot more money if I just stuck it out mining Bitcoin. But hey, you can't win them all.
Yeah, so I'm going to be giving the other panelists a moment because Nico's going to be running out very soon. Jackie, was it a question for Nico? I'll at the end then I'll have you, or do you want to shoot it out now?
They do
So okay. I respect that, and look, so I don't come from a traditional media background, but I've worked a lot in legacy media, and I've done a ton of legacy media work, and I understand that industry very thoroughly. In fact, I would say that if you don't understand the legacy media industry, you can't succeed as an independent media creator, and this is what I do for a living, right? So to address your point, in regards to the legacy media establishment or industry, right now, the internet is doing to it what the internet did to Blockbuster, what the internet did to Barnes & Noble. It's a phenomenon. And if that industry does not adapt, there was a very famous video of the Axios CEO basically freaking out, and he was at a dinner, at a legacy media correspondence dinner in DC, and he was reacting to Elon Musk, basically saying, Elon is not a journalist. He doesn't understand how much work it goes into being a journalist. He doesn't understand it. We're the media. He's not the media. What I would respond to that is, if you have to tell people that you're the media, you are not the media. And if you look at the viewership of all legacy media channels, including newspapers, TV networks, it's all going on a downward trend. And if you see what's filling its place, it's social media. It's taking it over.
Well, pardon me. I mean, we could dialogue later, and I'm really glad that you brought that up, though, because I do think that's why I let you say that, because that perspective is so important. It's very important, and I don't disagree with you.
Well, I think there's this, there's this whole concept of like trust the experts, right? But what we've learned over the past 20 years, or as we've all woken up on whatever timeline that is the experts are by and large lying. Whether it's malicious and intentional or not, that's a separate conversation to be had on like an individual basis. I've never worked in media, but I did live in DC for 12 years, and I know a lot about how the intel agencies work. And just because something is local or said by somebody like specific that you're told to trust, that doesn't mean that it's not a lie. Whether they're participating in the lie or not, it doesn't matter. It doesn't make it truth. So I think it's not a matter of like, oh, have you had this career? Do you have this degree? I mean, that's credentialism, which I think is not something we support. We're in Bitcoin, we trust proof of work. Credentialism is proof of stake, and I'm not into it.
Yeah, I mean,
you don't have to be a journalist to decipher truth. And to Michelle's point, we have witnessed during COVID how we were all lied to explicitly and clearly by these so-called experts. That's not okay, and we shouldn't allow that to happen at any point. We should give these journalists a hard job they have a hard job to do, and they should do it with intent, not taking their lines from on high. And that's what we've seen. We all know it, and it's time we call it out and use platforms to do so.
So the truth doesn't mind being questioned.
Yes. I'll add to guys' point. Okay, so like, what is a journalist, right? So essentially, before social media, there was a handful of TV stations and there was a handful of newspapers. The only way you'd be able to propagate a mass narrative is through essentially a handful of information gatekeepers. What the internet has allowed, you are all journalists in this room. You are all the media in this room. You're able to grow a platform without having to go through a handful of information gatekeepers.
Where's your credentials, sir? I don't.
You can grow a platform. You can grow a following. You don't need to ask someone for permission to pick up your phone and film something. And the reason that that has become more popular, independent media is becoming more popular than legacy media, is because legacy media abused their monopoly to sell the public on false narratives. And essentially, the public is like, you know what? Like, they're telling me that Joe Rogan is taking horse dewormer, and they're like artificially changing the screen to make him look more green and sick. And Joe Rogan, who has 15 million live views per episode, compared to the most popular show on any of the cable networks, it completely destroys their numbers. He just goes up there and he's like, dude, I didn't take horse dewormer. That's a sack of shit. And he invited the guy, the news anchor, who reported that on his show, and he's like, why did you lie to me? And if you see the phenomenon also with Trump in this recent election, you know, they said all these things about him, right? And there's a lot of things that I don't necessarily agree with Trump, like, you know, politics is like a very divisive thing. But if you see him on the Joe Rogan podcast, that completely contrasts with what the legacy media has been saying about him for so long. So, and not only that, YouTube actually deranked that episode. If you search for the Joe Rogan Trump interview, you couldn't find it on the YouTube results. Why were they so scared of the truth? So this phenomenon only happens because journalists abused their platforms, abused their ability to speak to the public, and now essentially what's happening is they're being replaced by the people that have the ability to build their own platforms, that have the ability to build their own followings without going through a handful of editors that get to decide what is the truth and what is not the truth. The truth is the truth. It's that simple. Legacy media within a decade is going to die, and independent content is going to take its place. And the people that decide that they want to continue watching CNN for whatever reason, they're going to have fun staying poor. Like, I don't know what else to say.
One thing.
I have to catch a flight. Thank you very much.
Mic drop.
Yeah, so I wanted to give Nico as much time as we could before he had to run, but now, you know, we've got some other panelists and you guys can start expressing yourselves.
One thing I want to say about just like legacy media, I turn on and have anybody here watched Mad Money? Mad Money? Jim Cramer. There's literally a reverse Cramer that is doing phenomenal, but yet they still put him on TV every single day, and he's literally doing and telling people to do the complete opposite of stuff that would be beneficial to people. And they're still giving him a platform to do so. Why? Does that make any sense?
It's like Adam Schiff.
I don't know where that just came from, but
Yeah, as
Sorry.
the MC god.
Peanut gallery over here.
Yeah, you know, and I don't think, please don't take us as suggesting or arguing that Twitter or YouTube or any of these means of acquiring information are perfect.
Prem, I'm going to interrupt you. Everybody wave goodbye to Nico right there and family.
We love you
Very
guys.
Grateful for them to make the effort. Come on all the way over here from Miami. Bye, Nico. Safe travels, buddy. We'll see you next time. Love, love, love. Okay, back to your regular schedule.
And I think one of the important things of like what Nico is doing is he's then taking all, you know, his job is to consume a ton of different media sources and to like pick what he thinks is important, right? That's the job that he has been able to literally manifest for himself. He didn't get that job, and I think that's one of the like kind of inherent problems with the media industry, the legacy media, is that they have all of these structures and vestiges that have developed over decades and decades. And maybe you could touch this a little bit, maybe with like intelligence agencies and how they feed information to the media. But you know, they've all these structures. Like for instance, yeah, maybe most people still get their media from local newspapers. But where do local news reporters get their information about the federal government? Where do they get information about their local police department? Where do they get information about their local city hall? They're getting all this information from these feeder patterns that have been defined, created, and managed by the establishment, by, if you want to call it the deep state, by, bureaucrats who work for these cities and just jump from one city to another. And they're promulgating a system that is inhuman. It has nothing to do with humanity. It has to do with continuing these structures and letting them to continue to exist. So I think when I said that most journalists are just doing their job, I mean, I really sincerely mean that. It's an industry like any other, and you're competing with people like any other industry, and there's a ton of people who just got out of J school just like you, and they're young, and they're willing to work for less than you, and you're all competing for the same few and fewer and fewer every year media jobs that exist in this country. And you think these people are going up there, ideological journalists, like, oh, journalism, truth, we gotta stand up for the public, we gotta fight with the fourth estate. Like, that's gone. These people are doing a job like any other industry. They're trying to pay their bills. They're trying to get ahead. They're human beings like you and me. So I don't want to demonize the media, but I think the system is broken.
What I want to demonize is the concept of just doing your job, and that's somehow like a blanket acceptance or pass on no critical thinking, no accountability, no freaking principles. Like, that's categorically unacceptable to me, and I think by and large people are rejecting that, which is why we see a rise in independent media and a fall in the legacy media.
100%, and to even further that point, think about somebody that goes on to one of these legacy media interviews and they have questions being shot at them they have 5 minutes to get their point across. Can you really get how somebody thinks and what they really are trying to get across in such a small amount of time? And that being said, look at, just like everything else, this is a free market. So where are people deciding to get their information from? Trump did win this election. Why? It wasn't because of legacy media. It was because he went to other sources of media to put himself out there, to let people know who he truly is. And because he did that, people saw who he truly was, and it gave people an opportunity to see him as a human being. And at the end of the day, that's what people want. They want truth. They feed on truth. Bitcoin is shining light on truth. Truthful money, don't trust it, verify. By verifying, you can understand the literally proof of work. So, I mean, and again, just like Michelle was saying, these people that work for these media companies, they're employees, not the employer. So it's not the journalists that are bad. It's the actual root cause of the system, which is and then to bring it back into Bitcoin, follow the money. Who is funding these media channels? These media channels are funded by the same things. I'm a big sports guy. I watch ESPN. I see Stephen A. Smith, not anymore. I don't watch anymore, but I'm like, I watch the same game he's watching. Why do I need to hear somebody else's opinion on something that I'm also experiencing? I'm a human being. I can critical think. I can come up with my own opinions based on what I see. And that, to me, is where I see journalists, great people, but there's a reason why people like long-range interviews, like Simply Bitcoin. There's a reason why they're succeeding.
Well, I think one of the reasons is because so I'm very passionate about journalism because I'm passionate about the truth. And so I was one of few and fewer people every year who had subscribed to the local paper, the Miami Herald, back where I live. And so, let's say, now it's 2024. Still, if you go to the Miami Herald and you pull up one of their articles. Now, this is an institution whose entire purpose is to produce journalism on a full-time basis. They have people who work there full-time. They have a staff, right? But you go to an article, there's no links in the article to previous stories that they had done to give you context of all the previous work, all the hours, all the effort that they had supposedly done on this same story. Stories evolve over time. And you lose all of that. Every story is like this just manifest, brand new, oh, here's 3 paragraphs of news, and there's nothing else you need to know. When even that, whether it's CNN, whether it's the Miami Herald, like that very own institution has done 70, 100, 1,000 hours on this very story, and there's not a single link in the article. And this is the standard of journalism in 2024? I don't need to be a journalist, and I don't want to be that kind of a journalist. I would be sad and depressed for myself as a professional if that was my work product. If that was the standard of professionalism that I brought to my country, to my community. That, hey, here's a little bit of truth from a certain point of view with certain quotes taken in a certain context, and no further context and no further reading and no way to follow up on that story. And this is the standard. So I'm sorry, the journalistic system in this country is broken. It's fundamentally broken. I have
That doesn't mean journalists are bad people.
Yeah.
No.
That's not what he's. That's not what
There's
it
good
is.
journalists.
Correct,
right?
100%.
So, but you got to source them out, where I think we can help as a Bitcoin community is incentivize those good journalists when they post good information, such as on platforms that can't be censored, like Nostr. How many of you have heard or used Nostr as a communication platform? There are good journalists on there, like Matt Taibbi, Glenn Greenwald, etc. So they're out there. Send them some sats, right? Incentivize them to continue to communicate truth to you and use those platforms to elevate those kinds of conversations and the quality of good journalism.
And one more thing I'd like to say, that, and just in general, like Bitcoin is a long-time preference. It's not about being first to a story. It's about, actually thinking like the repercussions of the story that we're telling. Are we telling them the truth, or are we just trying to be first? Sometimes being first, you get the most attention, but are you really doing the best service to the people that you're servicing? So take a step back and think about, okay, should I do something that's just because I want to be first and get all the attention, get the likes, and get all the notoriety? Or do I actually want to help the people that are, consuming the products that I'm telling them and I'm sharing with them? It's the time preference in Bitcoin in general. That's like the biggest thing. When Nico was talking earlier about, he knew it's going to take 6 to 8 years for a channel to grow. That's a Bitcoin first principle thing right there. If it wasn't about getting rich tomorrow, it's about putting in the work, and by putting in the work and by continuously doing it, it's going to result in being successful 6 to 8 years road. So I encourage everyone not to just look for a quick fix like Ozempic, but to put the work in. Change your diet, change your lifestyle. It's not going to happen overnight, but over time, you'll be better and you'll have a longer and more sustainable life.
So carry these thoughts that you're having from this conversation with you to the after party, all right? Because we still have limited time. We got one more panel to go. I just want to leave you with one thought. The fact that Simply Bitcoin exists, the fact that Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald can have full-time independent journalist careers, it demonstrates proof positive in the market that there is a demand for journalism. There are people in this world who are willing to pay for journalism. So I only hope that in the future we're going to see more and more journalists willing to take that risk and put their time and their livelihood where their ethics should be, and start producing real journalism that's true to their heart and to their soul, and ask the people who are benefiting from it. Because if you think your journalism is benefiting your community, then ask your community to support you. Thank you so much. We'll see you all later.